From District Heights, Maryland, Independent Line. Tony, go ahead, please.
And the Republicans claim that they're for smaller government, and they're going to create the Department of Homeland Security. What a joke. What terrorism attack have they stopped? I'll answer that. None. Let me tell you this. Since 14 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and this is the reason why I believe terrorism is a joke. 14 of the 19 hijackers are from Saudi Arabia, and we have not dropped one bomb on them. I guess if you have oil, it's okay for you to have terrorists. If you have oil to give us, it's okay for you to have terrorists. We're only interested in countries that we claim have terrorists that don't want to give us their oil. And we have the audacity to be overseas in other countries labeling their citizens terrorists. We're the only country that can get away with doing something so stupid. This war on terrorism is, and I'm going to tell you something else, it's starting to spread internally. We have cops treating black people like we're ICE.
Well, I don't agree with a single thing that caller said.
Clyde from Sicklerville, New Jersey, Democrats line. Go ahead, you're on.
Good morning, gentlemen. I feel unsafe, especially against foreign and domestic.
Greg from Lorton, Virginia. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I just got a couple things to say real quick. One is when it comes to guns in our country, I've heard a lot of discussion about this. The fact is we're awash in guns. And the thing is the criminals have the high-capacity magazine, AR-15, AK-47. They have them. So, it's too late. We just cannot get rid of all these guns. The next thing is, I just hate to see people living in fear of these terrorists. I mean, that's what the terrorist goal is. That's what they want to do.
Thanks, caller. Sorry about that. Only because
Washington Journal continues.
it's our weekly Spotlight on Magazine segment, and we're looking at a recent piece in the Atlantic magazine taking a look at the aftermath of September 11th and efforts to keep the United States safe. Is America any safer? And the author of that piece, Stephen Brill, joining us from New York. Mr. Brill, good morning.
Good morning.
What led you to ask the question?
Well, I had done a book about the immediate aftermath of 9/11 in 2003 and had gone on to writing about lots of other subjects and doing other things since then. And as the 15th anniversary approached about a year ago, I started to think, well, I wonder what's happened. I wonder what we've done. How would you tally the score of how much money we've spent? Did we spend it wisely? Where did we waste money? What are our vulnerabilities still? How did it change the country? And I approached the Atlantic with this idea for a massive project to just take a real look 15 years later at what we've done and where we are today.
So how would you assess where we are today?
Well, I think we're a lot stronger. We did a tremendous amount in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 and since to change our security posture from what it was on September 10th, 2001, which wasn't much of a security posture at all. We've done a lot to batten down the hatches, so that's the good news. The bad news is that the threats have multiplied and they've changed. So while our defenses are stronger, the potential offenses are even stronger. In particular, we've gotten pretty good at being able to connect the dots intelligence-wise and detect the kind of orchestrated, carefully planned, multi-party attack that was the September 11th attack. We're pretty good at finding out about that kind of stuff, but while that's been going on, as you know, we've suffered a new kind of threat from so-called lone wolves or small groups and even homegrown terrorists who don't have to breach our borders to get here and do us harm because they're already here. So, and that stuff is much, much harder to defend against, especially in a country where, pretty much anyone can go into a store and buy an attack rifle and go to a shopping mall and have the kind of firepower that other countries reserve for their police and for their military. So if you have the combination of lone wolves who are inspired by terrorist groups or who are just playing, so disaffected that they want to make their mark in the world in some way, if you have the availability of weapons and if you have people who aren't deterred by the prospect of death, those kinds of threats are very difficult to prevent.
If you want to ask our guests questions about the safety of the United States in the years since 9/11, 202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and for Independents, 202-748-8002. Mr. Brill, what's been the price tag for all this safety?
If you add it up, we've probably spent, just domestically, leaving aside the war in Iraq, which was supposedly a response to the 9/11 attacks and a response to the threats of terror, which it wasn't. But leaving that aside, we've probably spent something over $1 trillion. Some of it was very well spent. Probably 100 to 200 billion of it was basically just poured down the sinkhole. It was wasted on technology that government contractors in Washington promised would be infallible and that never worked at all. For example, we spent billions of dollars on a border security system that Boeing sold the government that basically had to be taken out because it just didn't work. All these alarms and sensors on towers all across the southern border, and they sent out alarms when mosquitoes flew over the border. They couldn't see down hills. The whole thing was just a total fiasco, almost a comedy, except it was a very expensive comedy.
As far as money that was well spent, what would you give as an example?
Well, we certainly did a good job of preventing exactly the kind of attack that happened on 9/11. We have a much better trained security force at the airports, as much as we like to ridicule them. We fortified all the cockpits in airliners so that even if someone gets on a plane, they can't get access to the cockpit the way they did on September 11th. We've installed a lot of good technology at our ports so that various potential threats, such as radiological materials at the ports, can be detected. We, all up and down the country, we spent some very good money for Homeland Security in our major cities. Again, on September 10th, we were the kind of country where a natural gas pipeline was pretty much completely exposed on the west side of Manhattan, where it was running from the Midwest up to New England, and it came up in this place on the west side of Manhattan, and basically, anybody with a minor explosive could have set the whole thing off. There are hundreds and thousands of instances of vulnerabilities like that we spent money to really to fix. The tunnels, the train tunnels running under the Hudson River, to take another example, where I am in New York, were so exposed that basically someone with a backpack bomb getting on a train could have caused much more death and destruction and mayhem under the Hudson River than the hijackers caused on 9/11. We strengthened the train tunnels. And there are lots of examples like that. So this is a story of tens of thousands of real heroes in the Department of Homeland Security, in the FBI, in our local law enforcement agencies, now working together to make us a lot safer than we were on September 10th. But it's also a story of a lot of wasted money and a lot of wasted effort and a lot of political posturing.
15 years after 9/11, are we any safer? The piece by Stephen Brill in The Atlantic for September, and he's taking your calls on this topic. Harry from St. Anne, Missouri, on our independent line. You're on first with our guest. Good morning. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. This is Harry Noel Caper, and yes, I'm from St. Louis. And Are we safer? Definitely not. And the reason we're not safer is because I have been fighting with the NRA since 1976 over assault weapons with extended magazines. Why don't we buy those magazines back, put a drop-dead date onto them, and give those extended magazines to the military instead of buying them? We're wasting our money. We're trying to throw dollars at it to fix and put Band-Aids on things. This is ridiculous. Tell our elected officials to get their heads out of the sand.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And if you talk to law enforcement officials, Homeland Security officials, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, conservative or liberals, they pretty much agree that it is a suicide pact. It is insane to allow people, even people who are on a terrorist watch list, to have access uniquely in this country, easy access to assault weapons. There are lots of things that we can't prevent, but one of the things we can do is if someone is inspired by ISIS or is just plain crazy and wants to go into a school or go into a shopping mall or go into a church and shoot people, at least make it so that they only kill 6 people before law enforcement gets there as opposed to 30 or 70 or 200 people.
From Columbus, Ohio, Lee up next, Democrats line. Lee, good morning. Go ahead. You're on with our guest.
Yeah, so just a simple question for your guest, follow-up sort of to Harry of St. Louis. In your opinion, or would you comment on, would this be a safer country if we were able to institute I believe it would probably be a rebate program of some type where folks could turn in weapons, couple that with, registration of weapons, focused on removing assault weapons from the hands of the population?
Well, sure.
I know it would be a multi-year thing, but is it, in your opinion, doable?
It's doable. Australia did it, to give you an example. Various cities around this country have done it at various times, had turn-in programs for guns. This is not rocket science. We are the only country in the world that allows this kind of easy access to assault weapons. We even allow, and the NRA has even fought restrictions on armor-piercing bullets, whose sole purpose is to penetrate bulletproof vests worn by police officers. What is the hunting value of armor-piercing bullets? That's insane, and it's a relatively easy thing to do compared to the other challenges of Homeland Security, such as dealing with dirty bombs, radiological weapons, bioterror. This is something we could do that doesn't cost much money and is fairly straightforward.
Mr. Brill, one of the most obvious things we saw stemming from 9/11 was the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. How did that merge go, and how is it going now?
Well, as I explained in the article, it was a logical thing to do in many respects to take, just to give you the most obvious example of the logic, it used to be that when you arrived at the airport, if you were flying into the United States from another country, you were greeted and inspected at the airport by an Immigration and Naturalization Service person to make sure that you as a person was allowed into the United States, and by a customs officer to make sure that the materials you were bringing into the United States were okay to bring in. Merging immigration and customs at the airport into one agency with one officer doing that obviously makes sense. It obviously made sense to take the various agencies responsible for various aspects of Homeland Security and also for recovery from a disaster. It made sense to put them together. That's the good news. The bad news is it created such a large agency that it has proven difficult, if not impossible, for any one person to run that agency and manage it in a responsive, efficient way. I think we've had a steady improvement. Jay Johnson, the incumbent secretary, my impression from all the reporting I did is that he is really focused on good management, on efficient management, and he seems to be having a good effect. But there is no mistaking the fact that this is a massive bureaucracy. There are all kinds of problems with a bureaucracy like this, but I think they've been making progress in the 13 years that it's existed.
How many agencies are under DHS now?
Depending on your definition, it's either 22 or 23, which sort of is, almost indicative of how hard it is to manage if there's debate over how many agencies are even there.
From District Heights, Maryland, Independent Line, Tony, go ahead, please.
And the Republicans claim that they're for smaller government, and they're going to create the Department of Homeland Security. What a joke. What terrorism attack have they stopped? I'll answer that. None. Let me tell you this. Since 14 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and this is the reason why I believe terrorism is a joke. 14 of the 19 hijackers are from Saudi Arabia, and we have not dropped one bomb on them. I guess if you have oil, it's okay for you to have terrorists. If you have oil to give us, it's okay for you to have terrorists. We're only interested in countries that we claim have terrorists that don't want to give us their oil. And we have the audacity to be overseas in other countries labeling their citizens terrorists. We're the only country that can get away with doing something so stupid. This war on terrorism is, and I'm going to tell you something else, it's starting to spread internally. We have cops treating black people like we're ICE.
Well, I don't agree with a single thing that caller said.
Clyde from Sicklerville, New Jersey, Democrats line. Go ahead, you're on.
Good morning, gentlemen. I feel unsafe, especially against foreign and domestic. Only reason why, not too long ago, we had a shooting on Egg Harbor Township in New Jersey at a Wawa and on the Atlantic City Expressway. A little girl in Camden got shot in the head by a stray bullet. You just feel unsafe. You're afraid to go anywhere.
Mr. Brill, also someone on Twitter references a point you made earlier, and they ask this: how flexible is Homeland Security today? Can they quickly adapt to the ever-changing approach of the terrorists? Are they proactive on that front?
Well, it's a combination of agencies. Homeland Security is much more engaged in sort of the nitty-gritty work of seeing who's coming in at the ports, at the airports, who's getting on our airplanes. The FBI is charged primarily with preventing an actual attack. And as I go into great detail in the article, they have adapted really radically and quite successfully, I think, since 9/11. On September 10th, 2010, the FBI went to John Ashcroft, then the Attorney General, and said, we need more money to fight terrorism. And Ashcroft turned them down. The FBI itself on September 10th, 2011, literally that day, briefed members of Congress and said that the current prime terrorism threat, this is September 10, 2011, was from animal rights activists. The turnaround in posture and positioning since 9/11 has been absolute. They've radically increased the size of the FBI, but more important, devoted lots of people, lots of resources to intelligence analysis, to connecting dots. The FBI and the CIA and the Department of Homeland Security constantly, daily share intelligence information, and equally important, share it, although sometimes in a grudging way, share it and exchange it with local law enforcement, who are the people who are on the front lines. So I think the adaptability, the flexibility is there. Having said that, there is a natural inclination among not only Homeland Security people, but politicians to fight the last war. In other words, whatever is currently in the headlines is what the politicians and members of Congress put pressure on the Homeland Security people to worry about. The example I give in the article is that you'll recall right after 9/11, a week after, there were the anthrax attacks, where someone mailed anthrax in an envelope to several media offices and offices of members of the Senate. And several people died. At that moment, bioterrorism was the watchword of the day. It was in vogue. We spent tens and hundreds of millions of dollars on biosensors to deploy in cities all around the country, but we never perfected the technology. The stuff doesn't work. When the headlines died down, we kept the biosensors out there. In fact, they're still out there in Washington and New York and in cities all across the country. There's one in Grand Central Station, these machines. And the consensus is that they don't work. But 15 years later, we've done nothing to improve the technology, even as we continue to spend $80 or $100 million a year just maintaining this stuff that doesn't work. And we don't hear anything about the threat of a bioterror attack anymore because it's not in vogue, it's not in the headlines. And the Department of Homeland Security, as I mentioned in the article, the officials were asked at a congressional hearing, which, by the way, not a single member of the press attended. If that hearing on bioterror had happened in 2001, it would have been standing room only. There was nobody there. And an Undersecretary of Homeland Security was asked, well, how you doing on this new technology that will actually work so you can detect a bio threat? And he said, well, we think we're probably 3 to 8 years away from a fix. So this is 15 years later saying we're 3 to 8 years away because it's not in the headlines. If someone mails another anthrax envelope to someone today, or if someone sprinkles it, God forbid, on the sidewalk somewhere, we will spend billions more to have that fixed by tomorrow. So that's a real problem. So there's flexibility, there's responsiveness, but there's also a tendency to run after the next headline, sort of the way soccer players who are untrained, everybody just runs at the ball and forgets the overall strategy and the overall game.
Here is Stephen from Connecticut, Independent Line. Hi.
Hey, Chief. Thanks for taking my call. There's so much stuff to talk about. It's such a big in U.S. intelligence. I just want to talk about a couple examples to point out. One is the overclassification, and then like the disconnect between, say, domestic intelligence and foreign intelligence. Let's take on stuff like some of the newer stuff, the cell phone threat in Paris, organized raids that took place in Paris. Now, an example of A-plus work would be of the Osama bin Laden raid. But all that stuff on the downside is so overclassified. Why don't the academics have it? Now let's go to some of the domestic stuff. The A-plus side, the response to Boston, lone wolf attack, I would say they schooled people. But I still don't see enough communication between these extreme ends of U.S. intelligence talking about. Like, nobody's talking about the cell phone intelligence threat.
Gotcha, Stephen. Thanks. Mr. Brill.
Yeah, I didn't understand the question. Shall we say?
He talked a little bit about information sharing, which you talked about. I remember after 9/11, there was this term called stovepiping, in which information would get stuck.
And connecting the dots is the opposite of stovepiping. We've done a lot to share information. We've also done a lot to deal with the reality of the fact that terrorism is going to happen. And this is where the politics sort of comes in. The Republican Party has attacked President Obama for admitting that some terrorist attacks are going to happen, and therefore, as a responsible president, he's got to spend money and effort on mitigation, lessening the damage from an attack, and recovery. So the Department of Homeland Security in recent years has has paid for a series of drills all around the country in various cities to get all the local first responders, the state, the federal, the city people, the fire departments, police departments, ambulance drivers, to get them to have a coordinated plan in the event of a disaster, and they've practiced these plans. As it happens, about 6 months before the Boston Marathon bombing, the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, paid for exactly that kind of drill in Boston. And as a result of that, because they had worked out in advance what method they would use to disperse injured victims to various hospitals around Boston, how they would deal with that, how they would communicate with each other, they were able to get the injured from that bombing to hospitals so efficiently and so quickly when it actually happened that miraculously nobody died who didn't die at the scene of the bombing. So that's planning, that's mitigation. It's sort of unsung. It doesn't make a lot of headlines, but there are efforts like that being financed and practiced all over the country. But President Obama, oddly enough, has been attacked by Republicans who say, well, if you talk about mitigation and recovery, you're throwing in the towel. Now, the fact is that we have to talk about mitigation and recovery because the real reality is the President Bush, who said right after 9/11, never again. This will never happen in this country again. That's just not realistic. It's especially not realistic in an age when you have, lone wolves or small groups with access to weapons who can be inspired rather than deployed from around the world. There will be terrorist attacks. The question, in part, is what we do to mitigate the damage, lessen the damage, and what we do to recover. And if we remember that the goal of terrorists is to scare us out of our way of life and to scare us into turning against each other to the extent that we're resilient when there is an attack, it foils their goals.
Louisville, Kentucky, Republican line. Ann is up next for our guest, Stephen Brill.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you. I just wanted she said when I called that, do you feel secure? And I said no, which is almost a lie. I don't. I think this United States in terrible shape, and that's why I kind of want to go with Trump, because he is going to try to stop some of this violence and drugs from being brought into this country. And I think that's what's causing all the crime. It's so much drugs. It's even now starting in Kentucky. I heard that they were shipping truckloads in here, and it's sad on the news every night hearing that so many has died. It's terrible. And I feel that Clinton's not going to do anything about it, and at least Trump said he'd try. I mean, you got to have faith in somebody, and at least he's going to try. And I hope he does. I hope he does put a stop.
And apologies.
Well, let me just say, with all respect to the caller, if the topic is terrorism, in the article I wrote, I praise much of what President Bush and his team did. Security, who I think was very effective, and I praise much of what President Obama and his team have done. But I must tell you that one of the areas in which both President Bush and President Obama deserve praise is they refused to take the bait and call terrorism a war against Islam. They refused to call it that, and the reason they did was the terrorists' major goal in their warped minds, what they want most of all, what they envision, is the great battle of civilization in which Western civilization fights a crusade against the Muslim world. That's the way they try to inspire people to join them. And President Bush never took that bait, and President Obama never took that bait. But Donald Trump takes that bait every day and makes this a war between us and the Muslim world. And to to my mind, and I don't want to get involved in presidential politics here, but to my mind, he would be a great victory. His victory would be a victory for the goals of ISIS, which is to have someone who's the President of the United States declare war against Islam and incite more people over to their side.
Mr. Brill, you speak about a program in your piece called Countering Violent Extremism, done under the Department of Homeland Security. Talk about that program and its proactive nature on these issues.
Well, what that program is trying to do, it's nothing more and nothing less than trying to sort of get to people, particularly youngish people, before they sort of go over to the other side, to reach people who might be disillusioned, might be disaffected, might be tempted to yield to the ISIS kind of propaganda online, and to find those people with online messages of their own, to go into the communities where those people might be and talk to their friends, their neighbors, their loved ones, and say, here's a way to reach these people, here's what you can do. It sounds really squishy soft, and it is, and it's the kind of thing where you can't really gauge results because you can't tell what you've prevented, but we'd be negligent if we didn't try to do it, because the other side is really trying to do it.
A $50 million price tag, you also say, for that program, too.
Right. But that's in money spent, all over the country for community groups, for websites, there's even a contest among colleges and universities to create the most effective peer-to-peer, age group to age group messaging in social media and online. So the $50 million is spread really thinly all around the place.
Let's hear from Michael in Dallas, Texas, Republican line.
How you doing?
Fine, thank you. You're on. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'm glad Bush and Obama didn't, take that stance, didn't get suckered in, Too bad Bush got suckered in and then going into Iraq, but that's another show, What I want to say is this, as far as a black man, black folks ain't scared, ain't scared of terrorism. Hell, we've been terrorized every single day we've been in this damn country. And
Don, up next, Gaston, Indiana, Democrats line.
Yeah, I watched that fiasco down there in Orlando that Sunday on CNN for 3 hours. The only good thing they did down there was that the first responders and the rest of them government people, the only thing they did was interview wounded people as they came out. They didn't send a damn soul in there to help anything. They knew there was only one shooter. Took them 3 hours messing around with their equipment before they ever did decide to go in. Hell, that's just another reason why people in this country, if you want any defense at your home or anything, you better have your own weapon. You can't depend on government at all. Thank you.
Mr. Bell, response to either of those calls?
Well, as for what happened in the bar in Orlando, I think we're waiting for the so-called after-action reports. Of course, you'd have to be skeptical of them since they're often written by the people whose conduct is under question. I don't think anybody, any person with common sense is against people having weapons for self-protection as long as they've been screened before they get those weapons, and as long as those weapons are not military weapons, but are self-protection weapons. My basic view of the world, and this comes from talking mostly to law enforcement officers, is that we ought to treat guns like cars. We certainly all have the right to drive a car, but before you can drive a car, you have to prove that you know how to drive a car, and you have to register the car, and that, you have to prove you're qualified to drive the car. I think that's that's the common sense way to treat guns. And by the way, if you wanted a car, you could get a car, but you wouldn't be able to drive, an Abrams tank down the street, which is probably the equivalent of an AK-47 when it comes to guns.
202-748-8001 for Republicans, 202-748-8000 for Democrats, and 202-748-8002 for Independents. Mr. Brill, in the last couple of weeks, the topic of hacking and cybersecurity have come into light. You spend a significant amount of the piece talking about cyber terrorism. Where are we as far as protection from it?
Well, you never know. I mean, we're certainly much more aware of it, but and you can certainly, I was certainly able to interview lots of government officials who say they're working on it, 24/7. There's a whole cyber intelligence, control center that I visited and that I describe in the article. But frankly, you don't know. I think in some ways the threat has been overblown. I don't think our power grid is quite as vulnerable as some people have said it is. I describe in some detail, again, the kinds of drills and exercises that the federal government has encouraged, in this case encouraged those who own our critical infrastructure, who privately own it, such as the electric power companies or the water companies, to go through drills and simulate attacks. And in this case, the kind of attack most likely to come to the power grid would be a cyber attack. Having said that, you wake up every morning and you hear about something else, whether it's hacking the Democratic National Committee or hacking, an attempted hack of, a voter site in Arizona or something. So you really don't know just how safe or unsafe we are. I know there are a lot of people who spend a lot of time now worrying about it, but it's one of those things where for all the effort you spend, we could still wake up tomorrow morning and there'd be some kind of a significant catastrophe.
Here is Jim from Ohio, Republican line for our guest Stephen Brill, contributor to The Atlantic, on his piece looking at the safety after 9/11.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm calling in regards to weapons in the hands of the citizens.
What do you mean by that, Jim?
What does our Constitution say? The Second Amendment. And I've asked people this, the word infringed, and how many people have read the Constitution? What is the definition of the word infringed? It states, I believe, to violate or to break the law. And I believe that it is declaring that if we are required, the citizenry, to have a permit, or the state is breaking the law, by making us have a permit to carry a concealed weapon.
Well, that, with all due respect, that may be what you believe, but the most conservative member of the Supreme Court in recent memory, Antonin Scalia, in the Heller decision, which was the decision that overturned the gun law in the District of Columbia, Justice Scalia himself said that this didn't mean that the government couldn't enact regulations to limit the kinds of guns and the circumstances under which people could have guns. And again, there's a clause in the Constitution that guarantees you and me the right to travel interstate. That doesn't mean that states can't require me to have a driver's license before I get behind the wheel of a car.
From Mike in Pennsylvania, Independent line, you're next. Hi.
Hi. The people die in this country every year in large five-figure numbers from heart attacks, cancer, and diabetes. even there's 600 people every year in the United States die slipping and falling in the bathtub. I was just wondering, why is there such a laser beam of attention on being afraid of terrorists and the terrorist danger when there's so many other things that can cause one's demise in this country that are much more prevalent? I'll take the answer on TV.
Well, that's a really good question, and it's a question I asked President Obama when I was doing this article, because you're exactly right. We regard terrorism as a different kind of threat. And I think it's because, first of all, we don't assume that we can slip and fall in a bathtub. And we don't assume that we're bad drivers. And we assume that we can control a lot about our health. And terrorism scares us and angers us because it's so unpredictable. Excuse me. And it involves innocent people. I mean, we didn't do anything to be the victims of a terrorist attack. And it really angers us because these people are our mortal enemies. We see them indiscriminately trying to kill, children. So and that's what terrorism does. It scares us and angers us because it's indiscriminate, it's unpredictable, and now we've seen in San Bernardino or in Orlando that it can happen anywhere. It's not just an iconic building or it's not just an airliner. You can just be in a community service center in San Bernardino or a bar in Orlando, and this can happen. So I think that's why it really it upsets us and causes us to focus more than the causes of death that you so rightly outline.
When writing the piece, Mr. Brill, what surprised you? Things that you didn't know before?
Something we haven't discussed. What surprised me was that we still haven't done enough about dealing with the threat of a dirty bomb, which is a bomb where you take radiological material of the kind that is used in a hospital or it's used in various industrial uses in food processing plants by logging companies. You take this radiological material and you mix it with a standard explosive, and it really scares people because when it goes off, the bomb might kill 2 or 3 or a half dozen people, but it produces radiation levels. When the police show up with their radiation detectors, as they now all do, it'll show radiation levels equivalent to a Superfund site around a large 30, 40, 50 square block area. And that will, in some ways, cause panic, cause you to have to abandon the area. I was surprised we hadn't done much about that, and including educate the public that those radiation levels are probably not as dangerous as the headline, the tabloid headlines might make them. The second thing I was surprised about, as I mentioned earlier, is we had not advanced the bio threat sensor technology beyond the rudimentary technology we had on the morning of September 11th. And that really shocked me and drove home the point that we continue to chase, today's headline as opposed to sit down and line up a list of threats and really assign a priority to them that is not based on headlines, but that's based on risk and based on the feasibility of dealing with the threat. We haven't done a perfect job of that. We've made progress, but we haven't done a perfect job of that.
Greg from Lorton, Virginia, go ahead.
Hey, good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I just got a couple things to say real quick. One is when it comes to guns in our country, I've heard a lot of discussion about this. The fact is we're awash in guns. And the thing is the criminals have the high-capacity magazine, AR-15, AK-47. They have them. So, it's too late. We just cannot get rid of all these guns. The next thing is, I just hate to see people living in fear of these terrorists. I mean, that's what the terrorist goal is. That's what they want to do.
Thanks, caller. Sorry about that, only because we have to move on to another event. Mr. Brill, final thoughts.
Well, I think that is what the terrorists want to do. They want to scare us and to come back to a point I made, the more we have politicians using that same rhetoric of fear, the better off the terrorists are.
Stephen Brill contributed this piece to the September edition of The Atlantic. Are we any safer after 9/11? Mr. Brill, thanks for your time this morning.
You're welcome.